Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Today's speaker is Raj Sampath. He's currently assistant professor of the philosophy of justice, rights and social change in the graduate program in sustainable international development at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. A long title. And thanks to our technology, wireless printers, which doesn't always work. I'm reading it from my gadget here. So he completed his PhD at the University of California, Irvine in the humanities, where he studied under the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. I hope I'm pronouncing correct. The founder of deconstruction. Subsequently, he did a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, Berkeley, and a DAAD Research Scientist Fellowship in Germany, where he published articles in continental European philosophy. From 2006 to 2009, he was an adjunct lecturer at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and continued to serve on the Provost Council for College Aid at the university until June 2012. His current research interests and disciplinary expertise include the following: the 20th century Anglo-American and European moral and political philosophy, theories of modernization and social historical change, epistemology and the sociology of knowledge in comparative religious studies, and comparisons of Western philosophy and the traditional African, Indian, and Chinese philosophy. Teaching interests include the Anglo-American, European, and Global South traditions of philosophical ethics and theories of justice when applied to sustainable development issues. Thank you again for joining us, and please welcome Professor Raj Sampath.
Thank you, Biro. Teshekula, to my friends. I wish I can add to that list, hopefully a future interest in Turkey. And my plans, I'm speaking with Biro and the Peace Islands Institute to see if we can make a trip to Turkey possible for this summer. So when I come back in the fall, I can perhaps give a talk about Turkey. So thank you for inviting me to the Peace Islands Institute. We'll keep the discussion very brief because I'd rather engage you in a conversation with some issues that may come up. I know in our audience here we have legal experts and profound experience in development. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not trained in international rights, but I do work in the development studies program at the Policy School at Brandeis. So today we're going to be speaking about the right to sustainable development. And the UN actually declared a right to development in 1986, and there's a long history of what happened with that declaration and the politics surrounding it and where it is today, 25 years later. I'm going to talk about that UN right to development, but I'm going to speak broadly what a right to development looks like with regard to a number of academic debates, mostly by political philosophers and legal theorists. But before we do that, I thought I can begin with a brief history of why the right to development even rose in the 20th century, what it means today. Before we do that, we really have to take a look back at the formation of the nation state. And this really is a European invention in the 1600s. It's part of the story of Western modernization. I don't want to go into the details of this, it's more of an academic presentation. But essentially, there have been two dominant paradigms in academic thinking about what the nation state is, how do they interact in the global political and economic system. Positivism in international relations basically says that just as a scientist can analyze elements of nature and discover laws of nature, the optimistic belief is that nation states, like elements and forces of nature, can be studied scientifically. You can observe certain patterns and rules and behavior by which nation states interact. Since then, others have been quite critical, saying, applying scientific laws to study nature is one thing. Studying the behavior of nation states, super nation states, China, the United States, Russia, it's not like doing the science. And we have more of a pessimistic view that nation states are essentially like children. They vie for power and prestige, they operate out of self-interest, and they compete. So those that have a more scientific view of the nation state still believe that we can perhaps discover laws by which we can shape our policies. Others are less optimistic and feel that the nation state is really rooted in self-interest and power. Also in the 1600s in the West, another cornerstone for modernity, of course, was the social contract. The idea that people can give up their limitless freedom in society and they enter purposefully into a state relationship. For one thing, protection from each other as human beings. So instead of living in a state of nature, we enter society, we enter into the social contract, we give up our freedoms, but in return we ask the state to protect us. But that also means protection of the acquisition of private property. And this really is the cornerstone of Western modernity and Western capitalism. What's interesting is that the UN Declaration in 1948, in Article 25, it lists as a fundamental right for all peoples around the earth a minimal standard of living. So back in 1948, there was an idea that in addition to basic political and civil liberties, freedom from torture, freedom from fear, freedom to assemble, political and civil rights, basic sets of rights that everybody wants. Back in 1948, there was a declaration that there should be a right to a standard of living. But also back in 1948 is the birth of the Cold War, as you know. Western capitalism, Soviet communism. This has determined the entire structure of the world up until 1989, the end of the Cold War. So the question for us is, why did the UN Declaration of the Right to Development occur as late as 1986? Prior to that, first-class rights, civil and political liberties, second-class rights, economic, cultural, and social, were two different bodies of rights. Naturally, Western democracies and Western capitalist societies, specifically the United States, would love to see the promotion of political and civil liberties and democracy everywhere. Did the United States endorse something like the right to development and economic development? No. The status of it today is unclear. So for Western capitalist democracies, the idea of a universal right to development for all countries everywhere is a bit problematic. It's a bit obscure. In 1982, a wonderful philosopher by the name of Henry Shue basically provided a philosophical framework to understand what basic rights are for everyone. What are the moral and political obligations of wealthy nations, industrialized, advanced nations, for poor nations around the world? And his argument is that there are at least three basic rights, according to him, that have to be in place to enjoy any other right. The right to vote, the right to religious expression, the right to assemble. Prior to any set of rights, three foundational rights are required. And for him, it was subsistence, security, and liberty. Subsistence, well, the ability to live at some minimal level, some minimal threshold. Who defines that? Is it the poverty line? Is it a price on wage? Is it... How do we define what the level of subsistence is for the world, not just for single countries? But in any case, subsistence, you have to live. If you can't live, you can't exercise your rights. Security, freedom from torture, from physical oppression, freedom from your life being threatened by any means. So security, basic human security, freedom from fear. Liberty, basic liberty, the freedom of movement. So these three seem to be foundational for a human being to enjoy all the rights. Correlated with those basic rights, are three duties, which he believes all peoples, all individuals in every country, all institutions in every country, and every country in the world, they are duty bearers. They're the ones that are responsible. They have the duty to protect these rights of subsistence, security, and liberty. There's one negative duty, that we not violate any of these rights, right to subsistence, security, and liberty. There's a positive duty. If we see others violating these rights, we must prevent that from happening. And finally, if there is a violation, if someone is hurt, we have a duty to compensate or to aid. So this really begins the discussion about what are our obligations, all of us in the world, but specifically individuals and institutions and wealthy nations for the rest of humanity. do not violate the rights, prevent others from violating the rights, compensate when one is violated. I won't get into the top two bullets about these two doctrines that dominated 20th century thinking about not only the creation of wealth, but the responsibilities for welfare. I want to highlight two important thinkers, though, that have responded to these two traditions. One is the American philosopher John Rawls, who's arguably the most significant Anglo-American philosopher of the 20th century in his attempt to think about a theory of justice. And then one of his students, who is also a very famous philosopher in our age, who responded to Rawls's perspective. Rawls did produce a theory of international justice towards the end of his life, 1999. He spoke about this duty to aid burdened societies, and I'll give you the definition of burdened societies in a second. Unlike others today, who can assume that every society will become Western, democratic, capitalist, operate by constitutional law, be secular, separate the church and the state, Rawls was the first to say that, in fact, as much as the Western democratic societies, maybe the United States, if you think about the Bush Doctrine, or if you think about Francis Fukuyama's idea at the end of the Cold War, that everyone should become like a Western capitalist democracy, be it the French model or the American model, not that they're the same. And Rawls said, no, actually in an international system where there's fairness and reciprocity and tolerance and mutual goodwill towards others, we have to recognize different types of societies. Yes, there are liberal democratic societies that are secular like the United States, but he says there are also non-liberal, yet decent hierarchical societies, perhaps constitutional monarchies, that are not liberal democracies. There must be a principle of tolerance between these two types of societies. Both of these societies, if they're endowed with a certain set of resources, have a fundamental obligation to assist burdened societies, societies that cannot develop, societies that perhaps are trapped in conflict or suffer from abject poverty. So both types of societies, whether they're from the West or the East, democratic or non-democratic, have an obligation to assist poor societies. That's his statement. Rawls, representing, though, this tradition of Western democracies and their capitalist economies, says we do not have an obligation to incessant or limitless or endless economic aid. That's not the issue. Our job is not to interfere with the economic growth of other societies. Societies must be self-determining, whether it's their population rate or their savings rate or increasing their income or generating wealth. It's up to that society to determine its path for development. But Rawls says that we must put into place at least the institutions that allow free citizens to make those decisions. So it's a very interesting distinction that's different from pure economic aid to stimulate growth. He's talking about economic aid to build institutions and let countries decide for themselves. Very ambitious thesis when he wrote this in the late 90s, and many people have responded since, one of which is Thomas Nagel. Nagel takes us back, despite Rawls' idea of an internationally just system in which nation-states are obligated to help poor countries. Nagel comes back and teaches us again that, well, thank you, John Rawls, that's a very ambitious idea, but let's face the reality of how nation-states work. Wealthy industrial nations do one thing. They go after resources. They try to position themselves in the world to have influence. We live in one such country. China is an emerging example of another superpower, at least over the last 20 years. So number one, the self-interest of nation-states. How can you have the self-interest of nation-states and a global right to development for everyone? Two, the problem of realizing global justice and world governance. We do not have a one world government. We don't live in the year 2300. This is 2013. We have a system of competing self-interested nation-states, and we have the shield of multilateral bodies that exist to monitor world security and rights violations, the UN. So no one world government, competing nation-states, and a multilateral body whose job is to secure rights. But the right to development, That's another issue. Hence, there's a difficulty in linking sustainable development, global poverty, and environmental protection with other more pressing priorities for the world system. Security, terrorism, despotic regimes, nuclear armament, other types of human rights violations, not the right to development, human trafficking, for example, or torture, and of course the International Criminal Court. Very few policymakers, philosophers, legal experts are thinking today, in 2013, about the outline or the concept of a one-world government. That's a frightening concept for most Western democracies, quite frankly. Others who have universalist ambitions, perhaps, maybe a socialist ambition, or even if we think about the Chinese and their designs for the future, perhaps they have a different view of a universal structure. But here in the West, it's very hard or difficult to conceive of a one-world government that would transcend the current international system of competing nation states in which a few countries, the G20, have an advantage over the rest of the world. Okay, so we do not live in 2300 where this imaginary world government exists to solve world poverty and eradicate war and human suffering. So what do we have in the present? There is a gentleman by the name of Thomas Pogge, also a philosopher at Yale, who with UNESCO back in 2002 built a workshop to rethink the possibility of how poverty, and I'll define what he means by extreme poverty, how can we start to see poverty, world poverty, as a violation of a human right? That's all he was asking. What is extreme poverty? It's not poverty in which one is sustained at a certain level, so just being poor but living a certain life. It's the type of poverty that is so extreme, or the type of hunger, that leads to premature death, when that death could be avoided. So it's these deaths that occur, perhaps hundreds of thousands per year, or day, excuse me, in which people are dying because of poverty or hunger. This is the type of extreme poverty that he feels is a violation of the human right. It does not have to happen in our current economic system, and yet it does. We all have this negative duty, to go back to Henry Hsu's threefold structure, not to continue to cause harm when we participate in the global economic system and its current framework within international trade, global multinational corporations, WTO, World Bank, IMF, the global financial system. So we have a duty right now to stop causing the harm that's leading to premature death, which itself is caused by poverty or hunger. In Pogge's model, as ambitious as that sounds, how can we stop participating in the global economic system? We just had a beautiful lunch here, which I don't think anyone regrets. But how do we stop, in our purchases and in terms of all of our commodities? He's not asking us to stop purchasing things or living in the global economic system. He's trying to figure out what is causing the harm to poor people today. How is absolute poverty increasing? Relatively speaking, some countries are doing better than others. In Pogge's model, the issue is we really do not have a sophisticated theory of causality. So for those of you that study science, when we talk about institutional relationships in the global economy, these relationships may cause indirect harm to single individuals. And that's different from interactional causality, or direct and simple activities that can lead to poverty. Perhaps the building of a dam, mineral or resource extraction, exploiting conflicts in certain areas. Perhaps in that realm you could see a direct cause in which somebody's intervention or activity is destabilizing a region or impoverishing a region. That's interaction. Institutional, though, is the interaction of nation states. It's the legal functioning of global multinational corporations. It's you in industrial advanced societies, whether Western or not, perhaps the wealthy in Turkey, making individual consumer choices, given the institutional framework that we live in, which by the way is legal. That would fall under the institutional indirect model for causing poverty. I don't want to get into the details of searching for creative solutions as to how we can stop causing the harm that's leading to poverty, extreme poverty. Are we talking about new tax regimes? If it's true that trillions of dollars sit in offshore accounts that go untaxed, very nominal percentage of taxation that can cover the 300 million per year that could help achieve the MDG goals. So what do we do about taxation? Monitoring wealth transfer. The UN sets 0.7% of the GDP of advanced industrialized wealthy countries for official development assistance. I think it dipped to 0.1 or 0.2 in the late 1990s for the United States, the richest, most powerful country. And truth be told, it did go up for the United States in 2003 and 2004. But as we know, the United States began an engagement in Iraq. So when you think about official development assistance, reaching the 0.7% itself is a very difficult thing for many wealthy nations. So what do we do with ODA? And then his idea of poverty funds, which I don't want to get into, but it is another example, as opposed to charitable aid. Types of funds based on the free markets, based on investments, but whose sole purpose is geared towards poverty alleviation. As ambitious as Bogey's ideas are, for many, he's still acting alone. The UN has not built a model of a certain right to development based on these ideas. So what are the obstacles? Why can't we implement some of these ideas? Again, it goes back to this issue of causality. The moral judgment. In 2013, all of you, all of us, Boston, the United States, North America, the West and the East, the North and the South, the impossibility of assigning blame for the existence, let alone causes, of global poverty. What is causing global poverty? A Marxist will have a theoretical definition, an explanation of what that is. Marxism is not a doctrine that's being adopted in the West, let alone these multilateral institutions, be it the World Bank or the UN or the IMF, as an answer to poverty. That was the Cold War. That's communism. Certainly there's socialist parties and Marxists all over the world, but no one is talking about Marxism as a way to explain the cause of poverty. Marxism was a doctrine from the 19th century to 1989. That blamed one thing, and you know what that is. Capitalism. In its very essence, is what causes modern poverty. And if you're a Marxist, that's what you believe. You can't be a half Marxist and a half capitalist. Marxism says that capitalism is what causes global poverty. But after 1989, and if you look at the realism of nation states, the realities of global politics in terms of wealthy nations, that's not the approach that we have to take. That's not a viable approach to take when it comes to global poverty. So that raises the issue. Who are these duty bearers? How are they responsible for their actions? Namely, the elites of the global economic system. Wealthy nations and their obligations to poor nations. Wealthy concentrations of power in both wealthy and poor nations. We are moving back to this notion of realism and self-interest. We have new non-Western superpowers on the rise, operating by their own interests in Africa, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. India is in the top 10 in GDP. Did you know that? And it probably will be top 5 if it keeps up certain growth rates. China's already number 2, as you know. India still receives development aid from Britain, because 70% of the Indian population lives in this abject poverty. A percentage of that would be in Poge's extreme poverty. So this is interesting here in terms of non-Western economic superpowers and the two worlds that they're living in, developed and developing, modern and traditional. And yet they operate by self-interest in terms of the development goals. I already mentioned no alternative to Marxism to compete with 21st century global free market capitalism. And then finally, a new international political theory, essentially. The future of globalization, new forms of interaction between the global south and the non-west, whether they're democratic, India, Brazil, China, and Russia or not. Russia, we'll bracket that. China's not a democratic country. So what are the interactions within the south itself? These are superpowers within themselves. They have no real concern about Western interference. I read in the Financial Times that these 4 countries, for example, have never been able to have a strong presence within the World Bank. The World Bank was created by European powers. It's always an American president that appoints an American to run the World Bank. And the speculation is that perhaps they would create their own World Bank, base it in New Delhi, or Johannesburg, or Beijing. And what that would mean for the entire history of development that we've had from the 1940s to now can change. Yep. So in conclusion, this is a very dense slide, so I don't want to give you too much. When Sarkozy became president of France in 2007, he commissioned 3 world-famous Nobel Prize-winning economists, Joseph Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, and Jean-Paul Fitoussi, the French economist, to say, look, we've been living with the GDP as the measurement of wealth. We've used that measurement of wealth to determine how well the well-being of societies is. So the wealthier you are, the better off you are. And that's the story of development. These 3 economists, and they are economists, not philosophers, came together in a commission to challenge the whole idea of the GDP. We in the United States rely on the GDP. So does China, and Japan, and the top Western European countries, and Turkey since the mid-2000s. You're in the top 20 now. Easily in the top 20 and climbing. So who can challenge the GDP? Well, in short, here are 4 bullets that I've come up with that try to link unemployment and income poverty with other factors of sustainability: environmental, economic, which is the debt crisis, environmental issues of climate change, global health has to be a factor, quality of life. Washington Consensus, neoliberal, free market, breaking down the doors of other countries to stimulate growth, but also in terms of the benefits that go to global north countries and companies, is the trade imbalance. We tend to force developing countries to import at our prices as opposed to taking their exports precisely as we try to develop. Trying to think beyond the Washington Consensus and neoliberal market-oriented growth. Gender and development was a major MDG goal for all countries around the world. There's some thinking that gender and development is the horizon for development, not just one clause or one issue, the rights of women in developing countries, but that we have to take into account half the planet's population as a type of labor that can be geared towards sustainable development, from the rural villages of developing countries to the issue of employment in the urban centers. And finally, the recognition in the 21st century, I think this goes back to John Rawls, I'll conclude with him, that we are living in a time after the Cold War, as Huntington said, where we are essentially multipolar. We have to learn to live with our differences, incommensurable differences, inside the West, inside the East, the North, and the South. We live in an essentially pluralistic world facing the same problem, global poverty, as opposed to a bipolar world or a unipolar world, perhaps for a brief window when America was the only sole superpower after the Cold War. So the right to development is, in fact, this is the latest we have. Get beyond the GDP. Think about the causes of global poverty. Think about creative solutions to wealth transfer. And then the larger philosophical ambition, which is my last bullet, is to think about the greatness of the best thinkers of the 19th and 20th century. That there is a viability to challenge the inequalities that come from global capitalism and globalization without relapsing back into a 20th century doctrine like Marxism. Thank you.
Thank you.